10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
And now, here's your host.
And it is a huge welcome to you all to episode 104 of the Reasonable Adventurer podcast show. I'm Colin Jones, and if you were listening to last week's episode, then you'd be aware that I'm on the move from one university to a new one, USQ. Very excited, new role, and the feedback from last week's show included some lovely well wishes, offering me some sage advice and just general looking forward to seeing what this might bring in terms of your career advancement. One of those people who reached out and left me some wonderful advice and some comments that sort of stirred my ire a little bit was Katy Wray, and over at Newcastle University in the UK. Katy's a long-time listener to the podcast show, and I reached back out to her and I thought, could it be that Katy might want to join us on the show and have a chat? My reason for that was that Katy's also been involved in not only enterprise and entrepreneurship education, but also lots of areas of academic development and working across universities to build programs. And I thought it would be lovely to think maybe she's got some advice she could share with me as I head into this new role. So, without further ado, why don't we head across to Newcastle in the UK and see what Katy's been up to. Katy, it's fantastic. I know you're ready to go to sleep. Obviously, the listeners can't see what you're wearing at the moment, which I'm informed is more Newcastle loungewear, but also could be interpreted as sleepwear or...
That's a grand opening, Cole. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not just the voice I'm dealing with. Obviously, I've got the visual as well, which is fantastic. Katy, you're one of our longest term listeners. You and Tom are most probably out there. Tom Williamson, always providing some feedback and letting us know that someone's actually out there listening, which is always great. You provided some lovely feedback for me from the last episode where we talked about moving into this very specific academic development role. So I wanted to sort of explore that a little bit with you, because you talked about, in the email you sent me, you talked about how you thought it was great that it looked like I was going into a good place, and that you yourself sensed that at the moment you were in this good place in and around helping others develop and the processes and the things that you're focused on. So I wanted to explore that a little bit with you.
Pre-COVID-19, I'm not in such a good place now.
No, exactly. But how has your world been developing in terms of your own career and your own passions in and around academia?
Well, I guess my first question is, how fast do I need to speak? Because I'm going to be listening. I'm going to be listening to this at times 2 speed.
Well, we could no, you can talk as fast or slow as you want, because, Yeah.
Right, well, let's start with what we were discussing before we started the recording, and my fascination with whether at any given moment, I suppose, you're an enterprise educator or just an educator. That big question for me, which I know that lots of people share, is it just good education? And actually, whilst I came into this with a very specific mission to embed enterprise education, I think I've probably spent more time battling why what I'm doing is not entrepreneurship, and therefore who am I and where am I to be supported in doing that? But then there's bits of time where I need someone to support what I'm doing, and there is the Enterprise and Entrepreneurship Network which I love so much in helping me and supporting me with what I do. So, that are you an enterprise educator before you're an educator, or are you an educator before you're an enterprise educator, is a really interesting thought to me, and it's something that you explore. You give us your opinion.
Well, most probably it also depends, I think, from your starting point. So if you came into this space purely theoretical, maybe you've done some research, you came through as a student, and the space appealed to somebody theoretically, then maybe you come into it as an entrepreneurship education advocate, who then maybe starts to realise the sort of the challenges in an educational sense that are present in the space, whether that's from a transformational learning context or whatever it may be. So maybe you then have to realise that to be effective in entrepreneurship education, you have to become really good at education to be able to be effective. Then, of course, there's a lot of us who come into the space because we were originally, in some context, an entrepreneur or a business owner. And so then you bring in the sort of fairly applied way of thinking about things. And so you're most probably an educator in the sense, but I would call it, maybe let's call it a naive educator. So you understand that there's more to the learning than can be just sort of captured in, say, a book or something like that. But you most probably don't have the tools and the sort of the background knowledge in terms of what is learning. So I think from wherever you come from, you have to sort of pass through this sort of education domain to sort of be able to move on to the next phase of wherever you think that development for yourself and for others is going to be.
And that's a real kind of confidence shaker as well, because I think every one of us, or even every educator, would have a different response to that. What's your legitimacy as an educator? What is the education part of what it is that you're doing, and where did you get that from? And it may be that you got that from being an entrepreneur, and as you say, therefore realizing that there's got to be a way that we can be creating value from what we're doing, but actually that's applicable to everyone and everything. So it therefore, I think, because I believe what I'm doing is applicable to everyone and everything, you start kind of questioning that legitimacy and saying, well, can I really be an expert at anything if I am an expert in everything?
Yeah, it's that saying, isn't it? To be everywhere is to be nowhere. And I think that's a sort of a challenge that we're all faced with. I've found over the last maybe 4 or 5 years that I've started off a lot of conference presentations or invited workshops by not seeking to insult the audience, but by disarming them. And I think we all build up a little defensive structure around us, around what is education and what do we advocate for and what are we comfortable with. And John Ruskin, 1917, wrote a book called The Stones of Venice. And I've talked about this in one of my earlier podcasts. I think it's podcast show number 5. But he said that the education of a person could be reduced to 3 questions. Do you know where you are? Do you know where you want to go? And do you know, therefore, what you need to do in order to make that journey happen? And his argument was that if you couldn't answer all 3 questions really well, you were uneducated. So rather than assuming education is something that people attain, I went to university, I completed the degree, I am now educated, I hang it on my wall to show people that I'm educated. He thought, well, education is something you move in and out of. You can be uneducated and educated at any moment of the day, depending on what it is you're trying to do. And I've found this to be a really exciting notion to get people to sort of come to grips with, because it levels everything back. It doesn't really matter where you're coming from and what you believe. If what's in front of you is a challenge, then embrace being uneducated. It doesn't matter that you have 3 PhDs. If you can't do the little task in front of you, then we can all celebrate the joy of being uneducated and working through how to become re-educated.
Yeah. So I absolutely agree, as you know. I think that's where this place issue comes in, or place identity comes in, because we're exploring, and we've been exploring for so long, but actually what works and makes you feel confident in doing that, and being uneducated at the same time as being educated. And I suppose the place where I am now, and we've talked about how we're perhaps passing each other in our move between academic development and entrepreneurship education, and kind of in and out and round about those terms. And I'm now finding that if I borrow somebody else's discipline, which is, I'm convinced is a discipline, more so than I'm convinced that enterprise and entrepreneurship is a discipline,
sure,
I'm afraid to say, I can do what I need to do in a context. And in fact, I can bring people with me, where actually before that, I've been in a world where I can only bring like-minded people with me.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So my context is science and engineering, predominantly at this moment in time engineering, because we're very active in that space. And we have the opportunity at Newcastle University to be changing, redeveloping, growing our engineering education, and also the facilities and things like that we have. For example, one of the projects is a capital project where we are looking to build a new hub of engineering, not necessarily a new school of engineering, because we want it to be across the whole university. And one of the questions is, we want to make, and I'd love to use a different word, but we don't have one yet, but we'd love to make a makerspace type place within that new hub. And I keep coming back to, everyone's having a discussion about what should be in there and what should happen there and which kit we should have and things like that. And I keep coming back to, we need an empty space where people can just meet and happen together and share ideas and have conversations. And actually part of this whole thing for me is getting people to have conversations that perhaps wouldn't have had conversations before.
Yeah, it's interesting because that notion you talk of there, I mean, this wouldn't be the right name, but thinking of something that would imply a hudagogical space. So it's like you've got all the walls are covered, even if it's metaphorically, with all of the repertoire of things that you could help people with. But you don't know what... It's like if you could take a child to a play centre and they have all the toys around the outside, and then the child gets to choose. They don't say, today you're going to play with the fire engine truck. The child looks around and says, you know what? I'm motivated to go off and play with that today. And the little boy comes in and plays with the doll, and no one says, but boys don't play with dolls. If that's what they choose, that's what they choose, right? If you have that empty space as you describe it, but everything that could support them and help them and guide them is all around the edges, be that the educators, the capacity to step in and whatnot. And so it's like an empty space, right? So it's not a maker space, it's empty.
It's not even things, though, that you said, the educators and their capacity to help. It is conversations. And I guess one of the things that we're trying to do is, and it sounds really daft, and I suppose all of the engineers that I'm working with would call this illegitimate rather than legitimacy. But it's giving people an identity and making that identity known so that you know what you can get from each other.
Maybe something like an inkling. You use that term, don't you? Inkling?
And I have an inkling.
Yeah, you have an inkling, right? Maybe you could have it as an inkling space. It's just where people have something deep back in their subconscious that they're not actually actively playing with, but they just have an inkling about something, and you can come in and you can inkle. You know, you can come in and inkle.
Because actually, one of the things that my own thoughts and research and practice take me to is that, and it becomes even more interesting in our current challenges and the climate right now, is that the benefit of university is being amongst the people, places, etc., rather than any of the teaching and formal activities that you're involved in. And it's knowing how to take advantage of those. And I think we haven't actually got to the point yet where we've created a structure that is sparked by the only thing that we have control of, which is the education process, to enable people to say, that's what I'm here for, find me for that you should go and speak to these people, and that network being coming from the environment of the institution being the really important piece that you take away rather than the degree that you have or don't have.
I quite often, when I try to visualise, I know back in my 2011 book, I was trying to find a sort of a grand metaphor for a lot of different things, but having gone to England so many times, I noticed, while I was in Tasmania, we didn't have multiplex cinemas. They were sort of moving in that direction, but they weren't as grand as some of the things that I'd find in the UK. And I that was one of the metaphors that I first started thinking about, was that teaching entrepreneurship education is sort of like dropping in through the roof into a multiplex cinema. You don't really know when the movie started. You might be stepping into someone's life. They're already a year into thinking about something, or they're still dreaming about it. You don't know what the genres are going to be. You really just have to try and react with all those sort of things. And so the metaphor that I've moved on, which is in my latest book, is this notion of intersections. And you sort of never quite know where your students are all positioned across all these different intersections. You don't know what direction they're heading in, whether they're coming back towards you or away from you, sideways, and so then how do you respond to understanding that the journey that someone might be on? Or maybe they're not on a journey at all. Maybe they're just standing there watching the traffic for whatever reason, right? And there's a learning opportunity in that space too, right? In the non-movement area.
It's so interesting that we always default to a way of being able to respond to the challenge of education is to give a highly structured modular system, which is assessed learning. And the amount of discussions that I've had with colleagues of all sorts where everyone agrees with each other that actually, yes, it is those intersections, and trying to challenge people around where they are now and what they want to do, and even back to Ruskin's questions of where they are, where they're going, and what they need to be able to get there. But then we kind of go, but universities do this. And that's your challenge for your time from now in academic development, is to really unpack without having, perhaps I might say, the burden of entrepreneurship within that, and say, I'm now here to work out how we make those intersections more explicit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the biases that I bring into the space, the recognition I have of my pretty sorry early life as a learner, when there was nothing particularly special there to look back on and think, wow, you really disappointed my mum and dad. Well, I was a very consistent student, put it that way. I was consistently bad. But I now understand a lot of the reasons why those outcomes were occurring, and so that actually makes it easier for me to try and unpack things. But what it tends to do is it tends to reveal more and more heterogeneity within both the student body of a particular class and of the educators in and around those areas. And that, I think, is the tricky bit for me, is that I love playing with the heterogeneity, the irregularity of things, and so many people find comfort through the regularity of something, of fitting in, of being like someone else, of approaching things. And I think that'll be one of my little interesting spots for me to sort of to play in, because I appreciate that while I'm very comfortable in messy situations, lots of people can't operate very well in messy situations. They need some clarity, and so that's going to be an interesting intersection for me to negotiate.
And even to question whether higher education is the place to do that, because I would also say that whatever kind of student I was and what I believe now about education are two completely different things. But I would still ask myself, because I see that in students now, I would still ask myself, would it have made any difference at that point in time? Or would I have still just taken my university life in the same way as I took it at the time? And actually, is it second career, changing career type development and education that is more purposeful for this type of...
Yeah, and I think that's a big part of it. Those sort of incremental evolutionary steps are not possible if you hadn't had the previous experiences, and they may not be something you look back on as fondly as you might other things, but they're necessary to make the journey. I mean, I don't have any regrets, and I don't have any ill feeling to anything in the past, because all of that, and I'll give you a classic example, I became quite frustrated at not being able to do certain things in my current teaching role, and as a result of that, it just created a more reflective me, where I could see this growing divide between my scholarly practice and my scholarship of teaching and learning. And they'd always been quite overlapping, but now there was a big divide happening there. As a result of that, the last couple of books I've written have really tapped into something that I wouldn't have been able to reach if that gap hadn't opened up.
I think you're right. That brings me back to this place piece, I guess, because what I think I've always struggled with is, what are the rules in an educational place that I believe doesn't have very many rules? And for me, science and engineering give me the rules. So it's a really positive place for me to be able to say, here's the fundamental parts of engineering that say it has to be that way. But also, interestingly, it gives something that has to be learned in a classic way. Engineering has to be learned in a classic way. You need to do the maths and you need to understand how things work. And so you can pair this thing that I still call enterprise or entrepreneurship education for the time being, with that classic model that then allows you to challenge things and grow things and invent things and create things in far easier ways than you could in a subject where there weren't such strict rules in the first place.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It makes perfect sense, because you've got to respect the context. If you're dealing with people who are teaching music or teaching nursing, you can't reduce that back to a homogeneous way of thinking about teaching and learning. That context is, it is what it is. But our ability to be more dynamic and more reflective in that space may not be naturally nurtured and developed by the pedagogical content knowledge of that space. And that's where, as you've noted, enterprise education can add something into it. And I also think that, from my perspective, good enterprise education has a strong scholarship component to it, and for me it's that scholarship component that enables you to sort of be able to work with people in other disciplines to help them become more reflective, more philosophical about, well, who are you in this space? What are you trying to do? How do your students behave? and sort of trying to find that nexus between how to become more effective at an individual student level.
It's also a challenging place, science and engineering, because they have a profession. And the thing I find myself doing a lot currently is trying to change what is being taught as professional skills. So all over the place we have professional skills modules or just skills modules, which are fairly meaningless because they're delivered as a series of dysfunctional skills all together in one context without being attached to something else. And so I'm trying to change, adapt, stop in some circumstances professional skills modules, and instead make them, what are you going to create while you're doing everything else modules. Well, that's not working title, that's obviously not the title, but we're not there yet. And you get the throwbacks that we've always had, but we need the word professional in there, but we need the word sustainability in there, but we need the word creativity in there, but we need this. And it's just, in a lot of contexts, we've come back to modules that I'm teaching and or involved in, and we now call them design and create, for example. And that's it. It's almost taking the fluffiness that I've been in for so long and making it just more clear, and it does what it says on the tin, kind of thing. Yeah,
no, it's interesting. Well, look, let's have another conversation at some point down the track. Let's check in when I found a way to get my hands dirty at USQ and have some of my assumptions knocked in different directions and find some sort of find my bearings in and around the process in terms of who we're working with and what are their aspirations, and therefore, what's the scope to be able to work with people, because I think you got to respect the context, right? And so you can't get too far ahead of yourself until you've actually found that context and made sense of it.
I recently interviewed a bunch of educators, and the first question I asked them, although I planned to ask it last, after the first interview that I did, I moved it to be the first question because I realised I gave the answer away if I asked it last. But my question to them, and they were not enterprise educators, was, what do you believe an enterprise educator is? And every person without fail was stumped and then said, I'm going to guess at this, but I know that you're an enterprise educator, Katy, so I'm sorry if what I say offends you in any way, but then usually attached it to some kind of description that involved a business or something like that. But then we unpacked it later, and I, as you know, because I asked your permission, I used your definition of the reasonable adventurer, and everybody without fail agreed that that's what they were doing.
Yeah, I've never met a student.
That takes us right back to where we started with, are you an educator or an enterprise educator first, and how do you go through that pathway? Actually, everyone is, or there are many people who are on our path to what education should look like.
Yeah.
It's just we haven't been given the context, the framework, the permission, perhaps, to actually work in that way.
It's interesting, over the last 15 years, since I've been working in and around this notion of the reasonable adventurer, I've asked thousands of students if you could graduate with either the piece of paper and take that, or the capacity to create opportunities for satisfaction, which would you prefer? I've never had anyone say they want to take the paper. So I think if we can find a way to strip back why we're here, what's the purpose of this education, I think that starts to open windows, doors, minds to actually thinking about something. And I think I got to the end of my little EE journey just recently by bringing in wisdom and thinking, I think this is the end road, developing wisdom, which is just another more elaborate way of thinking about the reasonable adventurers process. It's a more structured way of breaking that down a bit more. And I'm hoping that wisdom will be something that travels fairly well across the disciplines and the different people I meet at USQ.
I almost experience in every single case that if I can have a one-to-one conversation with a student, it works.
Yeah.
But en masse, it doesn't. So, this question of nobody's taken the paper.
Yeah.
En masse, at the beginning of a module, however, if you elicit from a group, what is it they want to get out of this? The answer is a piece of paper, a mark, a good mark, whatever. Yep. And actually, if you have a conversation with those people as individuals, you almost get an answer that says, do you know what? I don't even care if I fail this module. I just need to have learned the things that I now feel I've defined myself through having a discussion with you.
Yep.
Yeah. And isn't that interesting?
But I think it's the same.
We can't do that. How do we educate?
And I think the same type of thing applies in the academic development context, and that is, if we can work with people at the individual level, we've got an opportunity to have, one, to develop a relationship with people, to understand their context with some nuance, and then to be able to sort of do things over time, rather than assuming 30 people in one workshop, there's going to be an impact coming out of that workshop, when in reality it's about, that might create awareness or interest, but the hard work that needs to be done is always going to be at a one-to-one level, as it is with students.
That's right. And the way that I handle that is, every one of my classes now, I say, you're only going to do things and deliver things to me that are real. So each of you is going to go off in a different direction, but here's all of our starting points and all of our hopeful destinations. But the destination is typically a question of, find something that's worth, for example, more time, money, and effort to be spent on it. Could be anything, but every single student or group of students comes with a different answer to that question, yet they're all doing the same thing to meet the same piece. So I'm kind of playing the system, as you are and many of us are, to create an individualistic education within a mass environment.
Absolutely. Katy, I know you have to get up in hopefully not 5 hours. Maybe you get a chance to do it in 6 or 7 hours if your little child manages to sleep a little bit longer. Thank you so much for joining us today. I've really enjoyed our conversation. You can choose what speed you want to play this back on. That's entirely up to you. I'll definitely listen to it in just normal mode, because I don't want to make your voice go any faster than it need to.
Any faster than it does, you mean?
Yeah, well, that too.
Thank you, Carl. It's been a pleasure as always. You have 2 weeks left, and then go do.
Go do, exactly. Thanks, Katy.
Cheers. Bye.